This was recorded after the upcoming podcast, but I'm sticking it here to let you know that something so mind-blowing happened while I was recording this podcast that I just want to let you know that you will witness your mind being blown near the end of this episode 0002 of the Content Creator Podcast. I'm Andrew Michael Tarr. Hey there, fellow creators of content. Do you ever find yourself being creatively stagnant, not knowing what to do next? And I'm talking about either coming up with artistic ideas or deciding what to do next in your creative career. Maybe you're stuck in what they call decision paralysis, where there are just too many choices and you can't narrow them down. Or, on the opposite end of the spectrum, just having no ideas at all. Well, I just might have a sort of outside-the-box solution for you. In today's episode, I'm going to share a sort of radical idea for training your subconscious mind to guide you artistically and also in the big picture stuff about, roads that you should consider going down in your content creation journey. At least in the opinion of your subconscious mind. Now, you can look at the whole subconscious mind thing in a variety of ways. From the totally evidence-backed scientific standpoint of what the subconscious lobes of your brain do. I know that's not really medically accurate, but just stay with me here. From that to the more woo-woo tapping into the collective consciousness standpoint. Basically, your subconscious mind is able to separate its thinking from your conscious concerns about what you quote-unquote should be doing. At the very least, it can help you creatively when you're stuck in imposter syndrome mode. And this subconscious tapping into tool that I'm going to tell you about is actually the reason I even ended up starting the Content Creator Podcast in the first place. You see, I've thought about doing a podcast of some kind for years, but I always came up dry on the question of what could I possibly podcast about? So, okay, let me transition from teaser into intro. Welcome to the Content Creator Podcast, the podcast only mammals and birds can hear. So last episode, in telling you about this podcast's origin story, I mentioned the Gary V podcast that ultimately inspired me to start this podcast of mine. And I also promised I would tell an interesting story about that on a future episode. Well, the future is now. In order to tell you how I came about getting inspired by Gary Vaynerchuk, I have to go back a pretty long time, about 10 years ago, to tell you about a book I once read called The Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield. Now, this book, it's really cool if you get a chance to pick it up, if you haven't read it already. It is basically about coincidences that happen to you in life, which some people call synchronicities. Basically, the premise of this book is that when something coincidental happens to you in your life, you should pay attention to it because that is your subconscious mind trying to tell you something. I think in the book it's also a little bit more the universe is trying to tell you something, but I kind of equate those two things. And the suggestion is that if you start paying attention to the coincidences that happen to you, and write them down and follow them through, you will be led down the road in your life to things that are good for you. So, for example, you run into somebody in the supermarket you haven't seen in 10 years, and you say, "Oh my God, I was just talking about you the other day, and what a coincidence. I can't believe I'm running into you." Well, when that happens, we usually say, "How are you? Oh, great to see you. Okay, well, see you around sometime." But what you should do is say, "Okay, I was talking about this guy a few days ago, and then I run into him. Well, that's a coincidence that is probably a signal that I should follow this down whatever road it leads to." So you might say, "Hey, I was just talking about you a couple days ago. What's your schedule like? Let's grab a cup of coffee. I'd love to see what you're up to." When you do that, a couple things happen. First of all, oftentimes you are led to something your subconscious mind or the universe is trying to lead you to, or sometimes it just opens your thinking into a new path. Now, as an artist, as a creator, I think that's a pretty cool thing to pay attention to, because however much credence you give to the whole collective conscious, the intelligent universe, law of attraction type stuff, it's pretty undisputed that when you notice something, you do start to notice more of that kind of thing. Like once you start thinking of buying a midnight blue Tesla Model X, you start noticing midnight blue Tesla Model X's all the time. There's actually a part of your brain called the reticular activating system that filters out stuff that seems unrelated and helps you notice things that are related to things you're paying attention to. So when you start thinking about synchronicities, you'll probably start noticing more synchronicities all the time. And if you agree with me that your subconscious mind might have some useful insights for you that your conscious mind hasn't paid attention to, then you can probably see where I'm headed with this. So, for example, you want to come up with a new idea for your screenplay, but you just keep thinking about the same old 3 half-baked storylines you've been tossing around in your head for forever. And then you notice a weird coincidence, and it turns your attention to something that you would have totally ignored, like a midnight blue Land Rover or a space gray BMW. The point is, paying attention to synchronicities can totally pull your thinking into a new direction. At least that's what started happening to me about 2 months ago when I gave myself the assignment to start writing down all the synchronicities that I notice in my day planner. But besides starting to get some increased creative ideas after a dry spell that had been going on for a while, I also started to see the world in kind of a new way. And I'm sort of in the midst of a reinvention here, and this podcast is kind of the centerpiece of that reinvention, which I talked about in my first episode, but I also started seeing the world in kind of a new way. So, how did that lead me to this podcast? Here's what happened. About a month and a half ago, my wife and I met up with my nephew for lunch, and I'm sitting at this restaurant, and I get an alert on my Apple Watch telling me that Gary Vee is about to go live on YouTube. Now, I don't follow Gary Vee on YouTube or his podcast or anything. I read his book years ago, but I really kind of thought of him as mainly a mentor for entrepreneurs. And I guess everybody's an entrepreneur in a way, but I haven't really thought of myself as an entrepreneur. So I haven't followed Gary Vee. I mean, I like the guy. It's just that he hasn't really been on my radar. So anyway, about 3 minutes after dismissing the alert on my watch, my nephew mentions something about Gary Vee and asks me if I know who that is. So because I had been paying attention to synchronicities, I said, "That's weird. I just got an alert on my watch like 3 minutes ago telling me Gary Vee is going live on YouTube. Wow, what a coincidence." And I took down a little note to myself in my phone to add this Gary Vee coincidence to my coincidence list for the day. And because part of the deal is you're supposed to then follow up on these synchronicities, I decided to go ahead and check out Gary Vee's podcast. I had never listened to his podcast before, but I pulled up the podcast and picked a random recent episode to listen to. And that episode was really good. And it talked about something that has been on my mind for a long time, which is this. As I mentioned in my first episode of this podcast, I have spent a large portion of my life struggling with the fact that I do a lot of different things. I write songs, I'm an actor, I edit, I write, and I've always sort of felt like a little splintered, like I should pick one thing and just do only that. Well, that's what this Gary Vee episode of his podcast was about. He was saying, these days, the more you do, the better. And then he also said that's not just about what you do, but also even just not needing to stick in one lane stylistically or artistically. He mentions Lil Wayne and how Lil Wayne did a rock album. So Gary Vee says, I'm not confused about who Lil Wayne is just because he did a hard rock album. And that quote really resonated with me. It's what led to me thinking about the fact that, yeah, I do a lot of different things, and they all kind of fall under the header of content creator. That's what I am as a content creator. But I also create a lot of different kinds of content. Some of it's funny, some of it's trying to be funny and isn't, some of it's dramatic, etc., etc., etc. And then I decided to take another look at doing a podcast, and that's when I was hit with a revelation. Oh my God, that's what I should podcast about, being a content creator. And I realized immediately that there are probably tons of people who have spent their lives trying to figure out how to pick a lane when they have multiple lanes that they want to drive down. So my suggestion to you, if you are feeling stuck either in your career or just on a particular artistic project, is to give this writing down your synchronicities thing a try. Maybe you want to pick up the book, The Celestine Prophecy, because I think it might inspire you if you haven't read it. Or, of course, you can just dive in and start doing it. Write down anything that seems kind of coincidental that happened to you during the day. And then when you identify those things, try to follow up on them. Don't just write them down, but if there's something you think might be a message to you from your subconscious, to follow that string and actually take some sort of action to follow up on it. It has turned out to be a really powerful move for me that I'm going to continue doing forever. And I hope it works for you. But even if it doesn't, it's kind of a fun exercise, because when you start looking at the coincidences that happen, you just might be amazed at how many of them there are. Okay, something just happened that is so mind-blowing that it's going to seem like planned out, but I'm not even sure exactly what to make of it. But anyway, here's what happened. I was just wrapping up this podcast, the whole thanks for listening thing, et cetera, and I got a phone call. And I decided to take it because I figured I could just re-record the outro because I wasn't really loving how I sounded on it anyway. Anyway, I don't usually answer phone calls when I don't recognize the number, but my daughter's on the bus to one of her first tennis meets, and I figured I would answer in case it's her. Well, it wasn't her. It was the gas company. And I don't know if this really counts as like a synchronicity, but it's something that's amazing enough that I figured I'd go ahead and add it to this episode before I re-record my sign-off. Because here's what it was. The gas company just called me to tell me that I have increased gas usage since September 1st. And she wanted to know, is there something that you have done to increase your gas usage? Because from September 1st until now, it's increased and it's been a constant flow of gas. So I thought about it, and I remembered that September 1st, the DWP was repairing power poles behind our house. And that day they were in the backyard, like redoing the wiring. So I go into the backyard and we have a barbecue that's connected to the gas line, and the barbecue was on. So obviously what happened on September 1st was that one of the guys from the DWP bumped into our barbecue and turned the gas on. And it's been running for the past, I guess, 3.5 weeks. It's right now the 28th of September that I'm recording this. So basically the past month, gas has been leaking. And I am really lucky that it didn't turn into a fire. And actually so this is kind of a weird thing that I have to think for a little longer about what this all might mean, but this might really play into the whole synchronicity thing, because actually I have had a couple of different gas leak related things happen to me in the past. The big one is that I was actually a witness in a court case about 8 years ago, maybe, because there was a gas leak when my wife, Allison, was pregnant with our daughter, who I thought was calling from the tennis bus. when she was pregnant with her daughter, we took a trip and invited my wife's family, my in-laws, to go to Northern California for a little vacation weekend. And that's where we told them that we were going to have a baby. Anyway, about 4 years after that trip, my wife got a phone call from an attorney. Apparently, a week after we had rented that house, there was an explosion from a gas leak. No one died, but someone got seriously injured, unfortunately. And I had remembered smelling gas leaking on that vacation in that rental home. And so they brought me to Northern California for the trial, for the court case, and I was a witness. But we could have died if the explosion had happened a week earlier. It could have been incredibly tragic, obviously. I mean, it was still tragic for the people who were there. So I don't know what to make of this gas leak we've had for the past month, but I guess we've dodged 2 gas leak bullets, and this might actually be a synchronicity trying to tell me something, and I'm going to figure out what that something is. And crazily enough, there was another gas-related near miss that we had. After the baby announcement trip to Monterey, a week before that gas explosion, but before we actually heard from the attorney about that gas explosion, we took our kids, who were babies at the time, to Mammoth Mountain for a wedding, and we rented a little cabin. Well, our second day there, we all were a little tired and decided to take a nap. I wake up from my nap to this sound, tick, 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 tick. And I got out of bed and followed the sound. That ticking was the sound of our son Dash having found the gas stove in the kitchen. And he turned the knob, and it was gas leaking into the kitchen of our rental cabin. So I quickly turned it off, and I said to Allison, this trip is over. We can't stay here with a gas stove with a toddler who is interested in the gas stove. And we left. We drove back to LA. We got home at like 3 a.m. Anyway, that was our second gas-related near miss. And apparently, the past month has been the third one. So this is definitely a synchronicity that happened while I was recording a podcast about synchronicities. That's incredible. My mind is even more blown than it was when I got the phone call 10 minutes ago or so. And all I can say is, wow, what an amazing opportunity to share a sort of a synchronicity on my synchronicity-related podcast. Wow. Okay. Well, I'm gonna wrap it up there. This is sort of a rambling added-in section to episode 0002 of the Content Creator Podcast, but I'll leave it there, and I will thank you all for listening. I hope that you can find some synchronicities, and I hope that they are not merely tragic ones, but just simply synchronicities that help you on your artistic and content creator journey. I'm Andrew Michael Tarr. Have a great day.